Hey, how's it going, everybody? Today I'm going to be presenting my case for the reliability of the Gospels, and specifically answering the question, can we trust the four Gospel accounts? Presented to you by yours truly, Cameron Taylor, and hopefully you're watching this on my YouTube channel, Radical Culture. So let's just go ahead and get right into it. First, I wanted to address what I am not arguing. I think it's important to specify what topics we're not going to be addressing, so let's just go ahead and go over those. I am not arguing for the reliability of the entirety of the New Testament. I think we're going to be a little bit limited on time for that reason, so I tried to crunch it down to just the gospel accounts. I will be addressing different points made about the New Testament, but ultimately it's to help support the argument for the stability of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Secondly, I will not be arguing for the existence of God. I think that that's a completely different argument from this one, and you can say I'm presupposing it, but more or less, again, I'm just not going to have time to cover such a weighty topic. And then the third point I am not arguing is going to be for the evidence of miracles. Again, I think that's a detached argument. You can also say I'm presupposing that one, but again, I just think we're going to be limited on time and I'm not going to be able to address all the points there and try and prove miracles within my time limit. The fourth point that I am not arguing is for my personal beliefs. So this is going to be an objective take, and this is what the scholarly consensus is. While I do personally believe in the points that I am going to be addressing in the slideshow, it is to my best ability to try and keep this as unbiased as possible, at least in the sense that I tried to get an objective take on the topics we will be covering today. So without further ado, let's get into the main topics. So first, I thought it was important that we address, did Jesus even exist? Which is kind of crazy that I have to even ask that question, but let's just quickly go over it. So Jesus was a real historical figure, okay? And I just wanted to real quick say that the numbers next to each of my points are my correlating sources. I have a notebook here that I'm just going to be flipping through and reading off my sources. So my first point about Jesus being a real historical figure has to do with early non-Christian sources affirming the historical Jesus. Tacitus's Annals, 1544, and Flavius Josephus in Antiquities. So they both record Jesus as a real historical figure. I believe both of these historians were Jewish. My source for that comes from Gary R. Habermas and Benjamin C.F. Shaw from their essay, Is There Evidence Jesus Really Existed? Gary R. Habermas is a resurrection expert and a New Testament scholar, and he has his doctorate in history and philosophy of religion. And then Benjamin C.F. Shaw has his doctorate in theology and master's in religious studies. So my second point about Jesus being a real historical figure is Christian sources outside of the New Testament affirming the historical Jesus. Clement of Rome in his letter to the Corinthian church and Ignatius of Antioch's Trallians are my two examples. Again, that comes from the same essay, Is There Evidence Jesus Really Existed? My third point is that there are historical facts surrounding Jesus' crucifixion that virtually all historians agree upon. Again, Gary Habermas spent 30 years compiling the positions of historical Jesus scholars and noticed some matters where scholars were over 90% unanimous. So of course, referencing back to Gary Habermas, I actually got that source from Nabeel Qureshi's book, No God But One. Nabeel Qureshi is an ex-Muslim, and he actually was a candidate for his doctorate in New Testament studies before he unfortunately passed away. So I do believe he is qualified to speak on the New Testament and the historicity of Jesus. Speaking of historical Jesus scholars, what do scholars say? Scholars say they can be seen and used as significant historical sources. Bart D. Ehrman on the Gospels. So that's coming straight from Bart D. Ehrman, and that's actually where my source comes from, is Bart D. Ehrman, Did Jesus Exist? And he's probably one of the most qualified non-Christian New Testament scholars. Even he sees the Gospels as significant and reliable historical sources. My second quote comes from E.P. Sanders. He says that Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. And that's coming from E.P. Sanders, a self-described liberal, modern, secularized scholar. And again, my source for that is Nabeel Qureshi's No God But One. But again, that also comes directly from E.P. Sanders there. So these are just not conservative scholars that are the only ones on the take of, are the Gospels reliable? So my third point is actually not a quote, but it's regarding historian Will Durant. He holds a non-conservative view of the Gospels, but concludes that they are historical fact. My source on that is from Josh and Sean McDowell from their book More Than a Carpenter, which is usually sources from their other book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which is seminal work as far as manuscript evidence and New Testament and Old Testament reliability go. Josh is a lifelong apologist, Josh McDowell, but his son, Sean, is the one that has kind of the educational background. He has a doctorate in apologetics. And while they're not New Testament scholars, like I mentioned before, their seminal work is on manuscript and historical reliability of the Gospels in their book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. So I do find that this particular source, this particular subject is reliable to gain from these two intellectuals. My fourth and final quote on what scholars say is from Reza Alan. He said that regarding Jesus was most definitely crucified. Now, Reza Alan is a Muslim scholar, and he made this quote abundantly clear in an interview with Lauren Green. And I kind of wanted to pick him out because he is a different take. As you know, Muslims generally disagree with the idea that Jesus was crucified. So the fact that you have a Muslim not only saying that the gospel accounts are reliable, but he's also admitting that Jesus was crucified as a historical fact. So my next point is early church testimony and uniqueness of the gospels. And more or less very early on, how the church recognized the gospels as very unique in themselves. So my first point is that some scholars describe the Gospels using the Latin term sui generis, which is unique because many ancient Greek historians admitting to writing history they were not witnesses to. And my two examples are Thucydides and Plutarch. Unlike the claim of the Gospel writers, which was the complete opposite of that. They were all admitting to being first-hand eyewitness accounts of Jesus. So my source for that comes from F. David Farnell and his essay, Are the Gospel Accounts Reliable? F. David Farnell has a doctorate in New Testament studies from the Dallas Theological Seminary. And as you look, then my next 2 points are actually going to be sourcing him as well. My second point is that the 4 canonical Gospels were unanimously affirmed by the earliest Orthodox Christian communities throughout the Roman Empire. This again is recorded by F. David Farnell, and he's making it very clear and pointing out that the early church was very quick to accept the Gospels as they were. My third point is that no other names ever appeared on any of the Gospel manuscripts. So again, we have another fact here that is also affirmed by the early church, and I honestly think a point that a lot of people don't think of, and that's that no other names ever appeared on any of the Gospel manuscripts. So we always regarded the 4 Gospels as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because that's pretty much what they were called. Nobody else ever wrote their name, got it scratched out, or there was no collective group that maybe people were writing different pieces on and they eventually came and glued them together. It just wasn't the case. And my fourth and final point is that the unbroken chain of custody consisting of early church Orthodox bishops from the 1st to 4th century AD, affirming only the 4 Gospels and the names they bore. So this is pretty significant, and my source for this is actually from Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical history. So this is recorded very early on historically. The fact that we know and we understand this chain of custody and that it was unbroken and this is adequately recorded, then I would say we're sitting on some gold here as far as the Gospels go. So let's look at internal gospel testimony. So what does the Bible, what do the Gospels say about itself? Well, my first point is that 1 Corinthians 15 contains an early Christian creed formed within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. Christ died for our sins, was buried, and that comes from 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4, NIV. Of course, that's abbreviated. There's much more there. But yeah, that is generally considered in academia to be one of the earliest Christian creeds, and it's confirming pretty much everything that Christians believe in. As C.S. Lewis might say, the mere Christianity that we all abide by. And my source comes from James D.G. Dunn and his book, Jesus Remembered. And James D.G. Dunn has a doctorate of New Testament studies from Cambridge. So my second point is that many scholars also find Philippians 2:8 to predate the New Testament. And it states Jesus died by crucifixion. So this is pretty significant. Again, we have another verse here, not a part of the Gospels, but within the New Testament that possibly predates the New Testament, and it's stating that Jesus died by crucifixion. My third point is that John's use of descriptive words and details reveals his close acquaintance to the life of Jesus. So my example would be the Jewish feast, and I have all the verses there that you can go and cross-check me, as well as John also recording the exact location and depth of Jacob's well and Bethany. So if John was not actually recording history or was not recording a first-hand account, why is he integrated with all these Jewish festivities, customs, and these locations that are geographically and historically accurate? My source for that is F. David Farnell. So my fourth and final point is that Jesus' claims before the Sanhedrin passed the criterion of historical dissimilarity due to the title Son of Man being used more than 80 times in the Gospels, despite the Jews of the time never expecting the Messiah to be the Son of Man. Therefore, scholars are confident Jesus actually used this term for himself. So let me real briefly explain the criterion of historical dissimilarity. If something Jesus said or did is different from what the Jewish people prophesied or believed that he would say or call himself, then historians can pretty much determine that it's more likely that he actually called himself that name. And of course, the example here being the Son of Man. No Jew ever expected the Messiah to come back and regard himself as the Son of Man. So Jesus doing this and doing it over 80 times within the New Testament gives more than solid evidence, at least by this criterion, that Jesus really existed and really used this title for himself, and that at least this detail is historically reliable within the New Testament. But then again, if that small, tiny little detail is historically reliable, what can we say about the bigger details? So my next point is about manuscript evidence. I think it's very important that we talk about how the gospel, like I said earlier, is unique and different. And the manuscript evidence, I think, very much objectively points that out. So this is a quick list of the manuscript evidence and facts. All right, this is my first point, which is that earliest New Testament manuscripts date anywhere from 30 to 300 years from the original. This is relatively short for historians, and I'll show you a graph right after this that shows exactly why that is relatively short when you're comparing it to other sources from the ancient Near East. My source for that comes from Don Stewart and Joseph M. Holden in their essay, Were the New Testament Manuscripts Copied Accurately? Don Stewart is a professor of New Testament and Greek studies, and Joseph M. Holden has his doctorate in theology. My second point is that the earliest New Testament manuscript is the John Rylands fragment, P52, dated to around AD 117 to 135. So again, you have fragments of the New Testament that are within the century that Jesus lived, around anyways. I of course, people kind of debate that time period, but that's a rough guesstimate. But again, you have it right at the end of the first century, around 60 to 70 years after Jesus lived, which again might sound long, but historically that is not long, especially from that time period. That is extremely short. And again, please just stick through and I will show you this graph and it'll help put it into perspective. Again, that source is coming from Don Stewart and Joseph M. Holden's essay. My third point is that the Institute for New Testament Textual Research lists the number of manuscripts to the New Testament at 5,700. The next runner up is Homer's Iliad at around 1,900 manuscripts. And those numbers are actually a little bit outdated. I have a slide right after this of a graph, and I'll show you that the number of the New Testament manuscripts has actually increased. My source from that is also from Josh and Sean McDowell, More Than a Carpenter. My fourth and final point is that Simon Kistemaker, professor of New Testament studies at Reformed Theological Seminary, writes that we must conclude that the gospel stories were produced and collected within little more than one generation, reaffirming my point that the earliest New Testament manuscripts date within one generation of Jesus's life and ministry, which is considerable, especially from that time period. But let me go ahead and show you the graph and explain a little bit of why that is so significant. So here's a quick little graph here, and it actually, my source is right at the bottom there. It's from Josh and Sean McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which again is that seminal work about manuscript evidence. So at the top here is the number of original language manuscripts. So the New Testament is sitting at 5,600 plus. Right next to it, you have Homer's Iliad, which is 643. Plato, 49, Aristotle, any of his works is at 7, and that's the number of original language manuscripts. Now the span, like we were talking about earlier, the span of years, the graph right at the bottom, between the composition and the oldest copy, there's absolutely no contest between the New Testament. The New Testament is 50 max. Now I will say, I think that is a bit of a conservative take, but it doesn't matter. Put it at 100, put it at 200 years, that's still a 300-year difference between Homer's Iliad. And then between Plato, it's gone. It's ridiculous. Aristotle, the same exact thing. So the New Testament is hands down one of the most unique works from antiquity. So I think it's important that we addressed the textual criticism of the Gospels, and mainly the point of, does it matter? Because if there's textual issues within the manuscripts, well, then the amount of manuscripts and the time span does not matter. So let's just get right into it. My first point is that when all textual variants in the New Testament are considered, roughly 1% involve the meaning of the text. Authors of the book, Reinventing Jesus, conclude the short answer to the question of what theological truths are at stake in these variants is none. Now, of course, that source comes directly from the book Reinventing Jesus. I think there's 4 authors, 4 academics that wrote that book, but you're welcome to fact check me on that. But my source, my direct source, comes again from Josh and Sean McDowell more than a carpenter. My second point is that the variants in the New Testament text are not textual variants of historical, geographical, spiritual, or scientific fact. Pretty much the New Testament text or the variants within the text do not vary from anything major. The variants within the Bible don't actually affect any of the major doctrines, like I said earlier, the mere Christianity that we all believe in. My third point is that scribes who copied New Testament texts introduced changes that are of 2 types. So the 2 types have been categorized. And my sources for 2 through 4, by the way, I will read right at the end since they're all the same. So those 2 types of changes are unintentional and intentional. The greatest number of variants found in New Testament manuscripts are unintentional variants. So obviously unintentionals are something that the scribes didn't mean to put in there. Spelling errors, marginal mistakes, things of that nature. Intentional is things such as abbreviation. Michael Licona would subscribe to the idea of literary devices being used, that kind of thing. So again, reiterating this, the greatest number of variants found in the New Testament in the manuscripts, those manuscripts that we saw earlier, over 5,600 plus, are unintentional variants, meaning that they did not mean for them to change. They did not mean to make a mistake. My fourth and final point is that there is no evidence of widespread altering of New Testament texts for doctrinal reasons. So kind of playing off the second point here, again, there is absolutely no evidence of any tampering, at least with doctrinal mere Christianity principles. I don't believe there's any evidence of widespread altering to the New Testament text that we have today anyways, but it wouldn't really matter, I dare say, if none of the altering was done to doctrinal text. 2 through 4, all those were sources from the same source, and that source comes from Don Stewart and Joseph M. Holden, were the New Testament manuscripts copied accurately. So this is probably my biggest point, but I think it needed to be addressed in order to actually answer the question, are the Gospels reliable? And that is the resurrection. So I'd first like to say that you might be wondering, how is the resurrection objectively to be proven? Because here, obviously, I've come to the conclusion that Christ was resurrected. Again, separating all personal opinion, objectively, the resurrection hypothesis is the best model amongst the competing models to explain everything that is recorded within the Gospels. And if the Gospels are reliable, the resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation that we have currently. That being said, let's actually get into the evidence of why I think, very shortly, the resurrection actually happened. My first point is that virtually all scholars studying Jesus' resurrection, conservative, moderate, or liberal, acknowledge that Jesus' earliest followers were convinced Jesus raised from the dead and had appeared alive to many of them on several occasions. And just letting you know, all my sources come from the same person, so I'm going to read it at the end of what my source is. So this is pretty compelling. Conservative, moderate, or liberal scholars, which essentially just means conservative, you believe in the Bible, liberal, you generally don't, or you're skeptical, that across the board, all historians agree that the earliest followers of Jesus, his disciples, believed that he was crucified and raised from the dead and appeared to them. Whether or not you believe in the Bible, historically, that seems to be a fact. My second point is that scholars almost unanimously agree that 2 former skeptics, James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul of Tarsus, became believers after they, too, were convinced they had seen the risen Jesus. This is a point that I find naturalistic hypotheses for Jesus' death and resurrection are very incoherent at this point, because it's pretty much unanimously agreed, again, amongst all scholars, that James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul of Tarsus became believers, and not to mention Paul was a Christian killer. He killed Christians. So a lot of naturalistic explanations and models have a hard time explaining that fact of the matter. So I think that is a very strong point. My third point is that further evidence of apostolic conviction can be indicated by the willingness of the earliest disciples to suffer persecution and martyrdom. The empty tomb and the presence of other early reports of Jesus' resurrection, such as Acts, is so different within the Gospels, is so unique, And that's just a classic polemic right there for the evidence of Jesus' resurrection is, why would the disciples die if they were lying? The empty tomb is another one, right? The body of Jesus was never found. We can't find the body. So the idea of Jesus being taken down and hidden somewhere, most historians don't agree with that idea. So my fourth and final point, kind of in a culmination, is that natural theories for the resurrection have been proposed for centuries, and each fails by a large margin to explain the historical data. Incredibly, most contemporary scholars recognize this failure. So, what happens when these facts are not naturally explained? The resurrection of Jesus becomes the best explanation of the known data. Again, trying to hit on this objective point that regardless of how you feel about Jesus as a historical person, we know for a fact, based off of all the data provided, the resurrection hypothesis is the best model amongst the competing hypotheses. That is an objective fact. Now, let me give you my source for all of these points. From Gary R. Habermas in his essay, Does the Disciples' Conviction That They Saw the Risen Jesus Establish the Truth of the Resurrection? That's a long title, but that's the name of the essay. And of course, Gary, he has his doctorate of history and philosophy of religion, as well as he's considered the expert on resurrection studies. So, with all those cases being made, due to the evidence, we can come to the conclusion that Jesus existed. Scholars agree on substantive claims of the Gospels. Early church testimony and gospel testimony is reliable. Manuscript evidence is abundant. Textual criticism is minimal in effect. And Jesus resurrecting from the dead is the best explanation amongst the competing hypotheses. With all these points, what can we conclude? The Gospels are reliable. Absolutely, 100%, hands down. Historically, objectively, the Gospels are reliable sources.